Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome back to the PayPal IPN tutorial. Now in the last part of the tutorial we looked at a brief introduction to IPN, what it is, a bit about the database we're using, a bit about the code that we're using, and how IPN generally works. Now if you don't already have a feel for how it works and you didn't really understand anything, then try and follow along and hopefully you'll understand how everything works as a whole. So I've decided I'm not going to go and recreate the database and waste time because the majority of people might already be creating this from their own database. So let's just go ahead and look at the structure. First of all, the users table. So if you haven't already, you need to create a database, and mine's called IPN. And the first thing we're going to do is create the database, and then we're going to look at the code in a moment. So we have 4 fields here. Obviously, depending on the data that you're storing about your user, you may have more. If you're unfamiliar with databases even, then go ahead and ensure that you have looked at these before, because it's going to be a bit tricky to understand if you're not sure about SQL queries and such. So we've got a user ID which is underlined. This is the primary key. We've set it to a primary key and it's auto increment. All this means is every time we insert a record, this is going to update itself. We've got username varchar of 25, so 25 characters long, password of 32. That's only because we're using an MD5 hash, which will always equate to 32 characters. And then we have premium, which is at the moment a long integer, so it's an 11-digit integer with default of 0, but this can be a small int or a tiny int or whatever. So our log is our second table, which is important in our IPN.php. Remember our code just here, and the reason for this is important is we need to store the transaction ID that's generated by PayPal to ensure that we don't process the same transaction twice. If a user's already paid, then they attempt to pay again in the same session, then we are going to charge them twice, but they're only going to become a premium member once in this case. So we want to ensure that the user doesn't accidentally pay twice, or PayPal doesn't process the payment twice, whatever. It just means that we are checking every time we process a transaction that the transaction ID doesn't always exist. So this is a unique transaction ID. TXN is just what PayPal abbreviates transaction to, and ID is obviously the identification of the transaction, blah blah blah. You can see this in the IPN.php script. If we come down, this is TXN ID here, so I've just decided to call it that in my database. We've then got email, which is the email address that's payment that we pay with. So for example, if I was to pay for the premium membership and use the PayPal account alex@phpacademy.org, then this is what would be stored here. This is basically just so we know which email address we received a payment from. Simple as that. In case we need to maybe contact the user, I don't know. Okay, so we've got our table, or in fact I didn't go over the lengths and things of them. Okay, so the transaction ID actually needs to be a varchar, so let's go ahead and change that. That's one mistake that I've already found present. So let's change this because it does. I think it contains letters as well as it's alphanumeric basically. So let's go ahead and just change this to 30 because I'm not sure of the length. But obviously we're wasting characters here that we don't need. So go ahead and find out how long the transaction ID. It might be a static or dynamic length, I'm not sure, but for now I'm just going to put a variable character of 30. So now that we've got our database and our tables set up, we need to go ahead and look at the code that I've provided over in the phpacademy.org forum. So the code that I've provided for you is first of all the index page. Now all that I've provided is the login process itself. What I've then provided is if is set the session. So this line's basically, are we logged in? If we are logged in, we're saying yeah, we're logged in, and we're giving a link to the logout.php page, and we're also then processing this form here, or putting this form onto our page. The values here are empty. We're going to fill them in a moment because we need to know exactly what they do. If you're going to be doing that for yourself, it's very important. And then we're saying else, and then we're giving the user the option to log in. So the login process is all on the same page. If we are logged in, we're just saying you are logged in, and we're giving the user a form. So up here, what's happening, we're checking first of all that the username and password has been submitted. So if it has been submitted, if this button here has been submitted, let's just go back to our page and take a look at it. So if this button here has been pressed, then we make the relevant checks. Now there's no error messages here. I just wanted to keep it short and sweet. So we're basically saying if the login username and the login password, which correspond to these fields here, have been set, then what we do is we give a variable called login username, this value here, and the same with the password. Now I've used 3 different functions on each value. First thing I'm doing is wrapping this in HTML entities, just to ensure that if we do display the username or the password out or store anything like this, then we are ensuring that we're keeping this secure by storing the entities. We're not storing, literal tags, if you like, or tags in HTML. But you can read up at this function on at php.net anyway. So now the next thing we've got, which is very important, is the MySQL real escape string function, which is going to add slashes in places of special characters that might be used to try and SQL inject our query, if you like. So that's just a bit of security there. I'm also trimming the username and the password, so we've got trim here and trim here. That's just in case we add an extra space in. So for example, if I was to say Alex and then an accidental space here, or in fact an accidental space on the left hand side, this won't trim space from the middle. It will trim space from the left and the right hand side of the value. And we're also converting the password that's been entered straight to an MD5 string, so we compare that to our value in our database. So if you've worked with login and register systems before, you'll know that we convert our password given into the form to a MD5 hash and compare it to this, because our MD5 hash for our value will always be the same. Then what we're doing is we're checking if the login username and the login password both equal something. So if they're not empty, if they were to be nothing, then we don't process this part of the code. So if we have typed something in our username and password field, we then process a query. And this query is select user ID, because we need this value to store later on in a session. You can see down here we do that here. So select user ID from the table users, and this is where username is equal to the login username and the password is equal to the login password. So that's all I've done there. It's just returned a value, or we're checking the number of rows that have been returned based on this query. So the username and password must match in order to return the full row. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, go ahead and run it in phpMyAdmin and see how that works out, and put your own values in there and see what works and what doesn't. So we're now saying if MySQL num rows equals 1 of this query here, which is the query I've just explained to you up here. So if that equals 1, now why would it equal 1? It would equal 1 if we've supplied the correct username and the correct password. So if we don't supply the correct username and password, we don't run this code here. If we do supply the correct username and password that match the credentials in the database, we set a value, a variable called user ID, to MySQL result of our query, row 0, so the first row that's returned. Remember, we start at 0 always, and this is user ID. So essentially what we're doing is we are grabbing this user ID here, which is really important. We need to store this. The reason being is we're going to process this through PayPal, and this is going to know which value to update here.